The first question I have is, in the fourth chapter, Hart spends more time criticizing this orders backed by threats view, right? By the way, I just listened back to my recording and I apologize for saying the word right so many times. I don't know why. It was stuck in my brain. I was, it was like I'm a, Cockney guy always saying right. Anyway, um, so Hart spends a bunch of time criticizing the orders backed by threats view. The first criticism he raises is what he calls the continuity objection. So, how would the concept of law that Hart is developing here explain the continuity of one law ruler to another? Maybe before I get to that, can anybody explain to me how the continuity of government is supposed to be a problem for this law as orders backed by threats view? Like, why is this a problem? I think I saw Michaela's hand up first. Go ahead.
Hey, Professor. For especially in that fourth chapter, I mean, pretty much the whole chapter, the main problem was the fact that a authority or the leader or whoever is in power has the power of like fear and threat based off of persona and that relationship they build individually. So when trying to continue that power or their threat, there's kind of a hole in the middle of that because the next leader doesn't have that past persona or that past relationship with the people. So that's like the main thing where laws need to continue that way, where it needs to have like a plan to continue, but kind of like the Rex thing that like pretty much explained it because he had no type of continuous plan or something, just like the power he had.
Yeah, so you have Rex. People follow his people like he tells people to do things, and if you don't go to do things that he says, sends his pikemen to come and beat you up, right? Um, and then and so people this view would say, as long as enough people follow that, that's law. But suppose Rex dies, and then we've got Rex the second who's taking power. Well, now Rex the second isn't the same guy. He's just some guy for the purposes of this. And so the question is, why does anybody ever listen to Rex the second? Uh, yeah, he can send his pikemen to beat you up, but why do his pikemen even listen to him? Uh, it could be we could have a purely like economic analysis of this, I guess. But the question is that law now? When where X the second starts making claims about what you should be doing, um, saying, "Hey, this is a law." What makes it a law? And why isn't it that people just go, "Well, you're not the right guy who's issuing the orders, so I'm not going to listen to you." Right? Chloe, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, so they mentioned something in the lecture as well as in the reading about like it being a law of secession. So those rules that we need to bind ourselves towards is what makes us, give the sovereign the power of authority, not just the habitual obedience, the pattern of behavior to listen to that specific sovereign.
Yeah. So this is a common pattern throughout these two chapters is that Hart is going to develop this conception of what a rule is and say basically you need this concept of a rule in order to really explain what a law is in the first place. Because orders backed by threats is just leaving out this really important dimension of what law is, right? Um, okay, Marvin, do you want to follow up?
Yeah, actually, Professor, you kind of said what I was gonna say exactly. Because correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, but in chapter 4, I noticed that it seems like the law of succession is implied. Like, like we
Hmm.
think that like, okay, since this person died and like now he has an heir, that's what I said in my response. Like, since he has an heir or a child, then we can move on and rule, and that child will rule. But I noticed that Hart was saying that in the chapter, that wasn't actually a explicit law. Like, you know what I'm saying? So it's like now that's up to interpretation to like now the people like, well, he is the child, but it's like, do
Uh,
we have to follow him? Like, so it's like that stuff needs to be clear. That's why I kind of agree with Hart that like laws are pretty important.
yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So what's really important, one really important feature, and I think I'm glad you mentioned this, is in his like hypothetical example here, there isn't a clear line of succession necessarily. It's not like there is a law that says, um, well, let's see why this wouldn't solve it, right? Suppose you're Rex the First and you say, when I die, all of you people are going to be listening to my son instead of me. Uh, okay, so now that's an order backed by threats, because if you don't do that, then his pikemen are going to come beat you up. But when he dies, he's no longer around to issue that order or to maintain that order. So it's kind of like an order that if law was just orders backed by threats, it's an order that doesn't make any that like has no force to it. There's no author of it anymore when the guy is dead. So why would we listen to it? Why would we then go, oh, okay, we're going to follow that rule. We're going to follow that order. And now we're going to listen to his son. Because his son isn't the same guy. It's a new guy. So like, it seems like we need some kind of rule that the populace actually, in some sense, accepts and is willing to live by, that enshrines like this notion of succession. And without it, it seems like impossible. Without that rule, it seems impossible to understand how continuity of leaders is possible. Right? Yeah, I just said right again. Okay, anyway. Melissa, do you want to follow up as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of just did say what I was going to say, but there was an example that I thought was important to bring up. He brought up the Witchcraft Act of 1735, which I think is pretty important because like a woman was prosecuted for that like 200 years later. And
Yeah.
again, that just really shows why law kind of holds more power and is more persistent within like citizens rather than the person who even creates them.
Okay. So so this is actually a different point, but also a really important one, right? The question is like, how is it that law can persist over time? Right? So you brought up the example from that. How is it like, what's the problem for the orders backed by threats view that's introduced by this persistence objection? Like, how does this, can anybody expand on this witchcraft example? This lady is prosecuted for witchcraft 200 years after this law was passed, and nobody is paying any attention to this law. It hasn't been enforced for hundreds of years, but suddenly this lady gets prosecuted. The question is, how can the orders backed by threats view, or how is that a threat to the orders backed by threats view? How does that seem to undermine this view? How does it suggest something that that view can't account for? Oh, you're mentioning my cat. I don't even know yeah, this is Tilda, by the way.
So cute. What's the name?
Tilda, she's a little tortoiseshell.
Oh my gosh. Is she a calico or tortoiseshell, you said?
Tortoiseshell calico. Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
a calico as well.
They're real cute. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's a
Mine is
good
like
one.
fully white though. Fully
Oh
white with
yeah.
a little bit orange, yeah.
Yeah,
But
she just get the orange belly.
yeah. Can you repeat your question one more time? I actually want to answer.
Yeah. So the question was, how is the persistence of a law something that threatens the orders backed by threats view? Let's see. Let me catch up with the chat, and then I'll get to Carmel as well. Let's see. So, Fatima was answering this previous question about continuity. That's excellent. Frankie's talking about hear ye. Okay. So, wait, what was your name again? I have wrote it down. Let's see here. I know I did. Where did I put it? Let's see here. Rico. Okay. So, um, okay. You're saying that whoever passed the law is now long dead, so he's not around to enforce it anymore. I think that's good. Yeah. Okay. He's not around to enforce it. So how is it still being enforced? How is it still a law? I think that's good. That's a good, concise summary of the objection. Glad you guys like the cat. Carmel, go ahead.
Okay, I kind of forgot in the midst of all the cats. But I think the question that I was trying to answer was that um, if obedience depends only on fear and habit, then there's not really any legal authority, and it's just power shifting from like one to another. Um, and like, I think I'm trying to think of like what we were saying in the context right before this. But like if similar to what someone said in the chat, sorry, I didn't catch your name, but if they're not around to enforce it, then you can kind of just be like, you can pick and choose when it's enforced, when the rule, when it's, I lost my train of thought. But kind of just when it's beneficial for you to enforce that rule versus when it's not. And I think this is what like connects to chapter 5 of the rule of recognition, which is like uh like having an actual law and like rule in place, so authority can transfer smoothly, and even when leaders change, like the system continues on.
Yeah, so I think you're getting at what he thinks is missing from the orders backed by threats view, which I think is right. There's a sense of authority or a sense of rule that is missing. Um, yeah, I think that's right. I think we could say more about it though. That is correct. It's his ultimate diagnosis of the problem here, right? God, I have such a habit of saying right. Okay, so let's see here. Daisy, go ahead.
I wanted to expand on that point a little bit, and
Yeah.
please correct me if my understanding is a bit wrong. But from what I was reading, I understood that like the rule from the predecessor only continues if the successor allows for it to happen, I guess, or like if he accepts the rule to continue. But even if he does accept the rule to continue within society, it could just be like a standing rule where like people don't really act on it, if that makes sense. But please correct me if my understanding is a bit wrong. That's what like I got from the reading.
Okay, so this actually gets close to this idea of that Thomas Hobbes has about laws like this. Like, if you ask Thomas Hobbes, the famous political philosopher from the 16th century, what, how do we explain the persistence of laws over time? How is it possible that a law gets passed in one century, and then centuries later, there's this, the law is still in effect, even though everybody that was around when it was passed is now dead? Hobbes has a particular answer to this problem. Can anybody explicitly tell me what that answer is? And then this relates back to what Daisy was saying. Omol, do you just put your hand up in response to that? Do you want to go? And then I'll
Yeah,
come
I
back
think
around
it
to
was like
Harriet.
related to, sorry, it was related to like
Mhm.
acceptance. Like people accept, I guess like the law, like in this instance, like in the witchcraft society, people just expect what is enforced on them. Sorry, accept what is enforced on them. So like they do believe that people who violate it will get punished.
Okay, so they believe that people who violate it will be punished. I'm not sure that's what Hobbes is saying about these particular kinds of laws, because what we're the reason why why this witchcraft law is such a weird case for the orders backed by threats view is that it hadn't been enforced. So like very few people actually expected it to be enforced, and it was though. And then it wasn't like once it was enforced, everybody went, hold on now, that's not really a law anymore because you haven't been enforcing it this whole time. Everybody went, wow, I can't believe you're enforcing this thing that is in fact a law. That was how people responded to it. Like the question was, well, why do we still have this stupid law in the books? But there was no doubt that it was still a law. But everybody who had passed it was long dead and nobody had enforced it for years. I think this is one possible answer you could give for the orders backed by threats view, the one you just suggested there, Omo, which is like, if it could be the case that like, as long as you keep enforcing the law, people still fear the retribution of the state for failing to uphold the law. and therefore like we'll still act in accordance with it, even if everybody that passed it is long dead. But I think it gets into these weird cases when the law is not actually enforced. Uh, then this view seems to imply that because there's no actual threat and the person who issued the threat doesn't exist anymore, it's not even really a law anymore. To the extent that you take it to be intuitive that, yeah, it's still a law, it's just a stupid, old, anachronistic law that we shouldn't even listen to. It's as long as that intuition makes sense to you or seems right, this seems like an intuition that can't be accounted for by the orders backed by threats view. Um, okay, so specifically focusing on this issue um, of like uh, of this witchcraft law, I want to make sure we can understand like how is Hobbes going to try and solve a problem like that? And oh, hold on, I think the guy is here to clean my clean my chimney. I will be back in 2 minutes. Let's put a pin in this. Okay, be right back. I'm gonna close this up just so my dog and my cat don't come out and bother you. But all right, yeah, thank you, man. All right. This is probably the first time you've had a Zoom class where that kind of thing happened. Huh? I apologize for the interruption. Um, it will be nice not to have my house burned down, though. Okay, let's see. Getting back to the point, I think Harriet had a hand up for a little while. Can we go back to Harriet?
Hi, yeah. Well, it goes back to, I guess, the original question you had asked
Yeah.
about how, like the difference in time would make or I guess the large amount of time in between the
Mhm.
law like being there and then them like actually executing it, or enforcing it. And I think one of the big things would also be the actual like threat behind said law. So if originally it was put in place and there was like a specific punishment for it or a specific threat keeping them from doing that, how does that change in 200 years? Right? There might be different punishments at that time. 200 years is a really long time for any type of like government or any type of enforcement to be had. And like the same way that different different people in charge might give different punishments for different things, those, might change. So having something be 200 years in between those type of developments could be really hard to establish, I guess.
Yeah. So you're thinking maybe the idea is like you're kind of like stating the problem, right? Where we've got 200 years in between the time this law was passed and when it's actually being enforced. And nobody's actually worried about it for most of that time. The person who originally passed the law is long dead. So the question is, how is it still a law? Well, the orders backed by threats view seems to imply that it really isn't a law anymore because no one's around who to issue the order. And for a very long period of time, nobody was actually enforcing the threat. Yet, I think most of us would say it's still a law, even if it's kind of a dumb anachronistic law. Yeah. So I think it's a good statement of the problem for the orders backed by threats view, right? Okay, Trina, I think you had your hand up for a while, and we'll go back to Melissa and then Oscar.
Yeah, I was actually going to answer your original question of to summarize what Hobbes had meant when he
Yes.
stated, the quote, "The legislator is he, not by whose authority the laws were first made, but by whose authority they now continue to be laws." It just, in simple terms, it's like, just means like he believes that law comes from whoever has power at the moment, rather than, before. So even if a law was made by a ruler in the past, it counts as law as long as the current ruler allows it to continue. But by not getting rid of like old laws, the current sovereign is silently approving them. So obedience is owed to the present authority, not the past one.
Good. That's an excellent summary of the problem, right? Which is like of how Hobbes proposes solving the problem.
Right.
Basically, look, the current ruler, whoever that is, has given their tacit consent to this being the rule by not changing it. And so it's really you could take the current ruler as having issued a tacit order, still backed up by the threats enforceable by the state, to maintain this law, and therefore, yeah, it's still against the law to practice witchcraft even after 200 years, because the current ruler hasn't repealed that law. So, let's see, Melissa, did that basically cover what you were going to say?
Yeah.
Okay. Oscar, do you want to follow up? Is there more on this issue?
I was gonna say maybe sometimes because why even though leaders change, laws still remain is because sometimes the power, for example, back then, laws were being given by leaders and they were mainly they mainly have consequence to almost every single law. But today we got something like, for example, the Constitution is backed up by the people, and people want to keep the law because it protected them.
Okay. So this is actually a good point in the sense that he later goes on to talk about things like the American Constitution. It's connected with other problems for the orders backed by threats view. He's really down on this orders backed by threats view. He thinks it just doesn't explain the law. So the Constitution is one of the reasons why, and has to do with this idea of being an illimitable sovereign. So let's come back to that issue in a little bit, because I want to make sure we at least hit on some things in chapter 5 here. But yeah, I think that we'll put a pin in that note for a second. The broader point that I think you're addressing here too, though, is that Hart thinks that there must be more to law than just orders backed by threats. There's got to be whatever our conception of the law is, has to make sense of the sort of normative internal dimension of law. It has to make sense of what it is for a people to recognize and accept a law, outside of somebody just issuing orders and then if you don't follow those orders coming and beating you up. Right. Okay. So I want to make sure we close this loop on the persistence objection, though. Right. I've got, yeah, off with your head type vibe. So the persistence objection is a problem for the orders backed by threats view because it looks like something is still a law intuitively to us, even though the orders backed by threats view suggests that it isn't actually, because the people that issued the order are long dead and the populace hasn't been following the order. Hobbes tries to solve this problem by saying, well, laws are still orders backed by threats, but sometimes those orders are just tacit orders where the current sovereign doesn't repeal the law and therefore he's still issuing an order though, and people, if he had chosen to enforce it, would listen because then there would actually be threats. So what's Hart's problem with this? What's Hart's problem with the Hobbes' solution to this? Why doesn't this just solve the persistence objection? This is kind of tough. I addressed this on, let's see, it's slide 7. Let's go over to it. Okay. So Hobbes says the legislator is he who's not by whose authority the laws are first made, but by whose authority they now continue to be laws. And so by not repealing past laws, the current sovereign makes clear their tacit orders. But Hart thinks this can't distinguish between laws that were repealed in the past and laws that are just not enforced, but are still on the books. So there's a distinction here. There are all kinds of laws that were repealed in the past that we say are no longer laws. And then there's also laws that are still on the books, but nevertheless, we call them laws, but they're never enforced. It seems like this is a conceptually possible distinction, and yet, because in both cases, Hobbes's view implies like, look, this is just a tacit rule, or tacit order, sorry, not a rule, a tacit order that the sovereign is giving. They're both treated sort of the same way. And we think we can't these actually are conceptually distinct. Let's see, Trina, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna answer your question
Mhm.
about like you asked like what was Hart's like problem with this and like
Yeah.
according to slide 7 it just basically like he believes like it doesn't explain how we actually tell what counts as law.
Hmm.
So like to summarize, I'd be like his argument is based off of his belief that a ruler doesn't reappeal a law.
Mm-hmm.
Just because the ruler doesn't reappeal a law, it doesn't mean that the law is still valid, basically. Since so
Yeah.
many laws stay on the books, but they're no longer enforced or treated as real law, as per se.
And now, is this Hart's response to Hobbes, or is this Hobbes's view you're saying?
No, it's Hart's response to Hobbes.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So let me clarify this. So Hart thinks, look, we got these two categories of law. One is laws that were repealed way in the past. They're no longer in the books. We don't call them laws. The other is laws that have never been enforced, but they're still on the books. And they might be enforced sometime in the future if the authorities decide to enforce them. He says Hobbes's view that something is a law as long as it's tacitly commanded by the sovereign implies that both of these should be treated the same. For the whole period, so when we repeal the law and we don't enforce it, and say we don't enforce it, we repeal it 200 years ago, and now it hasn't been enforced because it's been repealed 200 years. The difference between that and a law that remained on the books, but it was never enforced, according to Hart, is substantial. But for Hobbes, he really can't make the distinction between those two because the ruler basically doesn't actually, in neither case is the ruler actually enforcing any threats or even saying anything. So these two different things that were, it looks like you got a law in one case and not a law in the other, Hobbes's view seems to treat as the same thing when it seems like they should be conceptually distinct. Let's see. Melissa, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So from when I was reading it, it kind of seemed like the main reason why Hart disagreed with Hobbes on this was because the people, so for whoever is ruling in a current administration, is not always fully aware of the rules that they're silently enforcing. So, like most people today don't know about these old laws and they can't secretly approve them, like he believes they have no right to. And it's like a silly process to him.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing that's important to emphasize is that like this book is in some ways kind of like a metaphysics of what the law is. So I think he does think that it's silly in the sense that it doesn't really explain, like this account he's critiquing doesn't really explain all these important features we think laws have. But it's important to distinguish that from like a normative critique of any of this stuff. Like you may disagree that we should have a king, for example. Or you may think that like the line of succession and how monarchy works is silly. Like those are like political or normative critiques of how power is exercised and how laws get made. Here, we're talking about however the laws, whatever the right justification for laws might be, what is a law in the first place, right? I think that's an important distinction to make. Another important one I want to caution you guys about is if I'm asking you like, okay, what's Hart's problem with this view? What I want is the critiques of this view that Hart provides. It would also be kind of correct to say the view doesn't account for these other important things that Hart likes or thinks are important about the law. But those would not necessarily constitute his critiques of this other view. So the basic structure of this book is him saying, okay, here's a view of what the law is. And here's all the reasons why that view sucks. And here's my view of the law he's going to be developing over time that doesn't suck so much, that doesn't have these problems. So if we're talking about his critiques of this orders backed by threats view, he's got a bunch of them. And those are separate from his more positive view of what the law actually is, right? I think that's an important distinction as well. Okay, so Hart's got beef with everybody else's theory of law. That's right. Okay, so we talked about Hobbes's solution to this problem, the persistence problem. We talked about Hart's response to Hobbes's solution. Let's move on to this discussion of sovereignty. Melissa, you're saying, was the question asking for his critiques on this? You want to make sure? Yeah, I was asking more specifically about his critiques. Yeah, that's right. And I think you kind of hit on both, but it's just important to keep these things separate. You should know both of them as we develop, especially as we develop Hart's more positive view of the law. We're basically in the part of the book where he identifies a bunch of problems with other views that people find persuasive. And then he's starting to show us hints of what his view is going to be. All right, let's move on and talk a little bit about sovereignty. So here's a question. What do I want to say? How do I want to put this? Why would the orders backed by threats view require what Hart calls an illimitable sovereign? Maybe I should back up even one more step. What would an illimitable sovereign be? Chloe?
Okay, so you can let me know if I'm wrong, but would it be a sovereign who is not bound by like the law at all, who's like outside of the law?
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Like think of an absolute monarch. A monarch who, whenever they say something, that's what the law is. And there's no restrictions on what they say. That is an illimitable sovereign. They can make it illegal for anybody to murder each other except for them. So the question, here's a question. Why does this orders backed by threats view require an illimitable sovereign? So an illimitable sovereign is somebody who answers to nobody but themselves. And it's not even clear they answer to themselves. Yeah, do you want to follow up, Chloe?
Yes, so the orders backed by threats rule wouldn't the orders backed by threats rule not apply to him like you said, because the law wouldn't apply to him since it's outside. And I think Hart mentioned in his works that's why the Constitution is so important, because the legislature and Congress is upheld by the Constitution as well, so they can't go above that.
That's true. So the legislature can pass all the laws it wants, but if those laws contradict the Constitution, those laws are unenforceable. They're not actually law. And this happens all the time. Like whenever the Supreme Court says, yep, that's unconstitutional, it's no longer a law. It doesn't matter that the Congress passed it. So I want to back up one step, though, and ask, just so we can put a fine point on this, why would this orders backed by threats view require that an illimitable sovereign? Why would we need a sovereign who has no restrictions on what they can do for this view? Go ahead, Harriet.
Well, I guess it would be hard for people to take the threats serious if the person who is threatening them can be threatened as well.
Okay.
If that makes sense. And if the person who is, if the sovereign who is I guess enforcing / like declaring these threats, if they can also be affected by them, it might be hard to enforce them as well.
Yeah, so there's two ways of putting this. One is to put this as a kind of a practical point, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we want to put it quite that way.
Okay.
So it's not that it's like practically difficult to enforce on a sovereign, because you would need somebody who's just as powerful. I think that Hart thinks there's a conceptual problem here, that it's not possible to imagine an illimitable sovereign or a law as orders backed by threats without an illimitable sovereign. Yeah. So I think you're on the right track, but we want to make sure to cast this in conceptual terms rather than like, maybe people wouldn't listen to this kind of person. Because I think what the orders backed by threats view people would say is, well, yeah, that's not even really a sovereign. If this person can get bossed around by the other person down the street, they're not really your king. They're just some dude, right? Okay.
So I'm so sorry, but so would it be like, okay, if this guy can make a law, right? A law telling this will happen, then if he is limited in any which way, then what stops me from making a law?
Well, I think we're still looking a little bit at this from a practical lens, right? Because
okay.
Yeah, I mean, one implication you might take from that is, look, if there's limitations on the sovereign, then like, well, yeah, there's limitations on me too. So what really distinguishes us? What, like I could be a sovereign.
Right.
Okay. So I think that's we're still in the right area, but we're not quite nailing it yet. As you're in the right track here. Let's see. Liana, go ahead.
So I kind of just want to add on to what you guys were just talking about now, and the sovereign having like an endless amount of well, the word just so bad, but essentially what I want to say is that that is how they ultimately hold their power, right? So I want to go back to what I saw in the text and just about what we were talking about, how there's been nothing established in terms of rights, titles, any sort of rules, any sort of succession, any sort of level of law. So the only way that the sovereign would be able to even govern in the first place is if they have all the power, because otherwise that whole system would just entirely collapse.
Hmm. Okay, so like if their power was distributed amongst a bunch of people and they had to listen to other people, I think this is still putting it a little bit practically, because like we would. This, by the way, is the kind of argument that Hobbes made. It was a kind of practical argument like this. He said, so you guys are like recasting an argument that is really famous, actually. It's really good. Hobbes said, the only way you have a functional society is if you have a sovereign whose power is unlimited, an absolute monarch who can do whatever the hell he wants. Because otherwise, you end up with all these situations where, like, if you put limits on this person's the only person who's going to actually be able to protect you with the power he has. And so you're just going to have to accept there's going to be one really bad tyrant who can control all the other little tyrants. That's better than having a bunch of little tyrants. But I think you could make that a moral argument even, but I don't think that it's quite the conceptual one he's making. Let's see. Amaya, you're saying the sovereign has to be above the law. Then Hart says this doesn't mean doesn't match real legal systems, which are limited to accepted rules, not just threats. Okay. This is another instance, I think, where we got to be really careful, right? Because, and I feel sorry that I think I'm hiding the ball too much with you guys on this. We don't want to say that Hart thinks that his major critique of the orders backed by threats view is that it can't account for rules or actual authority or real legal systems. I think he does think it doesn't account for real legal systems, and you could see the continuity objection and the persistence objection as like places where he says, look, real legal systems do this stuff. Your theory can't account for it. I think that's legitimate. But I think that his reason for this is ultimately like the structure of this book in general is here's this crappy theory of the law. Here are all the reasons why it doesn't capture what we intuitively think the law is. And so it can't be the right theory. So what's that theory missing? Okay, well, it's this other stuff Hart's going to talk about, like rules, for example. Okay, let me explain. This could be made crisp by just thinking about suppose you're a sovereign and your sovereignty consists in being able to issue orders backed by threats. You need to have an illimitable sovereign, because suppose there was a limit on what that sovereign could do. Suppose that I'm an absolute monarch and I can do anything I want except kill you. Well, if you ask yourself, why can't you legally kill me? And my answer would have to be, well, there's a law that says I can't do it. I mean, we're leaving aside moral considerations. Maybe I don't want to maybe morally it's wrong, right? But if there is a law that constrains me in how I exercise my power to issue orders and have them backed up by threats, if there are certain categories of things I can't do because of the law, then you have to ask, okay, well, if law just is orders backed by threats, who's threatening me? If there's nobody, then I'm not really under any constraint whatsoever. If there is and I'm illimitable. If there is some constraint, then you have to ask where that constraint came from. Who issued that order and whose threats are going to actually make me follow that order? And I think I mentioned in the lecture, there's some possible answers to that question that come from.
Sorry,
Oh, go ahead.
am I supposed?
Oh, did your mic end up open on accident, or is it?
Yeah, so sorry, that was an
Oh,
accident.
that's okay. That's okay. All right. So there's a conceptual problem here. The law as orders backed by threats view has to have an illimitable sovereign, because anybody that could impose restrictions on the sovereign is actually the sovereign. And it could keep going back and back and back until you get to the person who actually has full authority to issue orders and have them backed up by threats. So there's actually no conception of sovereignty on this view that isn't illimitable. That has any limits. And by limits, I mean laws that they have to follow. So on the orders backed by threats view, the U.S. Congress is not sovereign because it has the Constitution, which prevents it from doing certain things. It's illegal for it to do certain things. If the Congress passed a law that said you don't have any free speech anymore, that law would itself be illegal. It would be unenforceable as unconstitutional. Felicity, you're saying, and the checks and balances systems, right? Yeah, I think the checks and balances system is actually an illustration of the sense in which each of the branches of government in the United States are not illimitable. Every one of them has limits on what they can do, because the Supreme Court doesn't have any control over spending. It can't force the government to spend any money on anything. The House and the Senate, the legislative branch, can't pass laws that contravene the Constitution. And the president has to follow the laws, has to enforce the laws as they are passed by the legislative branch, and has to enforce them in a way that's constitutional too. So every one of these branches has a limit on what they can do. None of them are illimitable. Okay, so if we've established that the orders backed by threats view requires an illimitable sovereign, and we know none of the branches of government are illimitable, then where does sovereignty lie? Like, where could a person who holds that view locate sovereignty in a system like the United States? Umo.
I think like it was like Austin who said that like it falls in the hands of the citizens because they are sovereign. But then I remember Hart saying like it makes no sense.
Yeah, he hates this view too. Yeah, do you want to expand?
Yeah, I think like it was kind of like it was in the lecture and in the book. It was like the population itself is just like forced to like obey their own laws basically. So it's like a cycle. Like the cycle kind of just comes back again here. But like basically that like the people have the power here.
Yeah, okay. So the people are supposed to have the power. That's what Austin says. The people are sovereign. And Hart could ask, okay, wait a second, but the people are the subjects of law. And Austin, the proponent of this orders backed by threats view, would have to say, well, yeah, in one capacity, they are the subjects of law because they got to follow the law. In another capacity, though, they are the makers of law. They're the legislators because they get to choose what the laws are through their duly elected representatives. I mean, there's also a problem. There's all kinds of weird problems that Hart doesn't even really get into here, which have to do with like, in what sense is the people as an undifferentiated mass sovereign? In the sense that like, if I can't choose to make what the laws are because I got to go through a democratic process with all of you, isn't that a limit on my power? I'm not sovereign. But if no one of us is sovereign, because all of us are limited by having to go through the democratic process and each of us gets one vote, then none of us are illimitable. It's only the combination of all of us that's illimitable. So that looks a little weird. there might be ways of accounting for it, right? Maybe that's okay that the population is illimitable. But there's another further problem that Hart spends a lot more time on, which is you can ask this question like, okay, but how is it that the people get their capacity as a legislature? Because Austin says, look, the people act with two capacities, one as subjects of law, one as makers of law. And Hart asks, okay, but how do they get the capacity to be makers of law in the first place? Where did that come from? What are the possible answers? Any thoughts about this? How do we get the power to, how do we become the sovereign? How do we become the makers of law? What gives us the ability to make laws? Go ahead, Chloe.
I guess in a sense, maybe when we vote, like on like with big bills and such, like with the power, or in reference to maybe because there's primary laws and secondary laws, the secondary laws being the power to give us, the ability to make contracts and even, make new laws in the climates of different change in the society developing as well.
Okay, that I think is Hart's positive answer. Yeah, he's going to say, look, we accept rules. There are basic rules, both primary and secondary, that we accept as members of society that allow us to have the capacity to be legislators, to have sovereignty. But the notice that the orders backed by threats view has no place for rules in it. It doesn't say laws are laws because we all follow a certain rule. That's Hart's view. The orders backed by threats view says it's not a law if it's not an order backed by threats. So notice that what that means is if we ask ourselves, what law gives the people the capacity to be lawmakers? It would need to be a law that came from somebody else who is threatening us that if we don't act as lawmakers, we end up, bad things happen to us. And Hart thinks there is no such person. There isn't anybody behind all this that is issuing all these orders to us and threatening to beat us up. We have this simple conception of law because this is how we interact with the law so often, where if I steal from somebody and a policeman sees me doing it, I will get taken to jail. And so it looks like, well, all the law is just the fact that if I steal, that this policeman told me to do something, and that if I didn't do it, I'd get taken to jail. But Hart is saying if you follow that thread all the way back, it requires a rule maker at the beginning. It requires the first person who is issuing these threats. And there's it requires that person to be illimitable. This is almost very similar to some of the arguments you see in metaphysics with regard to like the existence of God. So like Aquinas has this argument that there must be a first mover, that the universe couldn't go on into infinity, into the past, with just cause preceding effect all the way back into the past. There needed to be like one thing that started it all off. Well, Hart, you might analogize that here and say like, well, Hart is he's making that same kind of infinite regress problem for the orders backed by threats view. You could always ask what law gives this person, allows this person to serve as the sovereign. And then that either there's no answer, or the only answer is that they're bossing themselves around, that they are ordering themselves and threatening themselves, which also looks weird. It means that like the people are issuing orders to the people that are backed up by threats against those same people, which seems, I don't know if it's incoherent, but I think Hart thinks that it's just like a strange view that we should only accept if we have no other good view of what the law is. Yeah, so it's like an infinite set of, you might think of it as like an infinite an infinite set of Russian dolls, right? That just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller as you keep opening them up. And there's no end to it. All right. Um, okay, so that's one way of thinking about this is like he's got an infinite regress problem that the orders backed by threats view just can't handle. All right, so Chloe just brought up the distinction between primary and secondary rules. Can anybody give me a crisp definition of the two? What are primary rules about? What do they do? Yeah, Omo?
Yeah, I thought of it as kind of like not self-imposed, but like in a way like societally imposed like rules that people humans have to follow, and just certain actions that they're forbidden from taking.
Okay. Yeah, it's like don't jaywalk, don't murder, uh, don't litter, don't steal. These are rules that proscribe certain actions. Yeah, good. Daisy?
Yeah, so primary rules are basically like rules that tell people what they should and should not do. And then secondary rules are just telling you like how rules are made and how they're like enforced instead.
Yeah, secondary rules give us guidance really on how the primary rules can be changed, added to, have rules removed or altered. Um, so the target of secondary rules is not behavior, but rather primary rules themselves. So Hart thinks that this notion of primary and secondary rules, if we introduce it, will help us better understand what the law is, as opposed to just being orders backed by threats. There's got to be more to it than that, because we have this kind of infinite regress problem. We've got this continuity problem of how does one ruler replace another and still have the authority to give orders backed by threats? Like, why do people listen to this new person rather than continuing to listen to the old one or doing whatever the hell they want now that that old one is dead? Um, how is it that a law that's on the books but unenforced for 200 years is still a law? Um, how is it that we can have a system of government that seems like it is premised on limited sovereignty, um, on a non-illimitable sovereign, somebody who gets to make the laws but is themselves subject to a law? These are all questions that do not get good answers, Hart thinks, from the orders backed by threats view. And he thinks the way to solve this is to introduce this distinction between primary and secondary rules. And he's going to develop a little more conceptual machinery as we go on to implement this, to make to apply this notion throughout the concept of law. You're asking, uh, can I give another example, like an example of secondary rules? So a secondary rule would be like, um, if you are drafting a contract, you must uh, include both of the names of the parties to the contract. And if you fail to do that, the contract is void. Another example of a primary or of a secondary rule would be a law that Congress passes only becomes enforceable if it conforms with the Constitution. Oh, hold on one second. Got to check in with the guy here. Yes. Okay, so I finished there. Oh, okay. The level that she wanted it to be. Okay. Okay. Now I just need a little signature over here saying that you were here while I inspected it. Yeah, let me just take a quick look at it. Sure. Yeah, but yeah, if you don't mind letting yourself out, thanks a lot, man. Okay, let's see here. Again, I apologize for the interruption. The only time this could be done. Uh, Frankie, you're asking if I play League. I do play some video games. But yeah. Okay, let's see here. Not that one anymore. But let's see. What was the point? So the point, getting back on track, Hart is going to make this distinction between primary and secondary rules. I was just talking about some examples of secondary rules. Secondary rules are basically rules for making rules or rules for altering rules. And these are, he thinks, all throughout our legal system. They account for contract law. They account for a bunch of, the laws of trusts and estates, everything that governs like marriage and family law. These are things that involve giving people certain powers to do things that they wouldn't otherwise have were it not for the legal system. And they also account for how we can have a system of law where the sovereignty at the top is not illimitable, but limited. So, bringing all this together, and we'll probably end up hitting on this right at the beginning of class next time. But bringing all this together, the idea is once you have this conception of primary and secondary rules, there is this, you can make sense of the internal character of law in a way that you could not make sense of it with just the orders backed by threats view. Can anybody tell me, I mentioned in the lecture that the orders backed by threats view is sort of behavioristic. Does anybody know what I mean by that? What does it mean for a theory about something to be behavioristic? Yeah, Marvin?
I want to take a stab, Professor, but your questions be very specific.
That one is really specific.
Yeah, that
I'm
one
using it
was
as a launching off pad, but yeah.
okay. Yeah, because I was like, whew. But I think that one, how could I answer it? I would say I believe, like, could you repeat the question, like the beginning part, and then I'm gonna get it. Yeah.
What does it mean for a theory to be behavioristic? And this is related, Umul, to the internal versus external aspects of rules. Yeah.
Isn't it like in order for that action, like you can have the theory per se, but like the theory can become an action once you do it?
Okay,
Or
that's close. That's
yeah,
close.
maybe I'm a little confused.
No, you're in the right area. Yeah.
Okay,
It
okay.
has to do with actions. Yeah. Okay, Trina, I think you had your hand up first.
Yeah, sorry, it takes me a while to unmute myself, but um, yeah, I think by what you mean when you say a theory has to be something that's like what when a theory is behavioristic would be like when I explain when a law is explained by observable behavior.
Yeah, good.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So like there's a theory, here's an analog, right? There's a theory in psychology called behaviorism that some of you guys may have heard of.
Right.
Which that theory explains psychology by reference not to people's internal mental states, but rather only by reference to their external actions and behaviors. And here, Hart is criticizing the order spec by threats view for being excessively behavioristic. It's only concerned with how people actually behave, not the internal workings of their mind that actually makes up what Hart thinks the law is. Because there are all these things going on in people's minds when they interact with the law that simply can't be explained only by their external behavior. And you need this conception not only of this distinction between primary and secondary rules, but also the sense in which people use these rules internally. They see these rules from within their own, from within, rather than having them just imposed up from without and, mechanically affect their behavior. They see these rules with a normative gloss, right? They see them as legitimate. To say something is a law is to say it has a certain legitimacy to it. You may not agree with the law. You may think even that the law is immoral. But in saying that it is a law, you're saying that it was sort of past created and is enforced in a way that is at least legally legitimate. And so this is the sense in which, and I'll get back to these examples hopefully next time, of this example of like the stoplight, how we could understand what's going on with the stoplight. If you see it just from an external perspective, a behavioristic perspective, you only see people stopping when things are red and going when things are green. What you don't see is that there's a rule governing that system that everybody that interacts with the system respects and accepts. Or even if they don't respect it, they accept it and act according to it because of that acceptance, right? Okay. Yeah, like having to pay your taxes, Frankie, yeah. We may not like it, but we do it. And it's not just that it makes us do it. We, in some sense, recognize it as legally legitimate. Okay. So we'll get back maybe to this draft dodger example and the other, the light example next time, just to round out these last two chapters. Again, I apologize for the interruptions to this class and my somewhat frazzled approach to it today. We will resume with normal regularity next week, talk about the next few chapters of Hart. So I should also be able to get your stuff graded this weekend. I know I have two assignments I need to grade, so I'll be working on that. And just know that if it shows that it's dropped right now, that's fine. It's going to show the first 4 is dropped until you get to the 5th one. Then it'll drop whatever your lowest 4 are. And that's the plan. All right. Have a great week, guys. We'll continue next week, and I will resume with the picker wheel. So come ready. I'll see you guys later.
Thank you.
Professor.